So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you for being part of this panel discussion. So I would be introducing this discussion and also our speakers for today. So very warm afternoon, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this virtual seminar series organized by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I'm Janice Lee, the moderator for today's panel. I'm an assistant professor at the Asian School of the Environment and Earth Observatory Singapore based at Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. I'm also a collaborator under the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. It is my pleasure today to be the moderator on this webinar on the science and practice of tropical peatland restoration. I would like to thank the director, Professor Lian Pin Koh, for inviting me to co-organize this webinar with folks from the center. So next slide. Let me just try. Yulin, if you could help me to click on the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So a bit about our center. This NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions is newly established this year. It aspires to be a focal point for research and thought leadership for natural climate solutions in the Asia-Pacific region. Natural climate solutions tackle climate change by protecting and better managing natural ecosystems. The center's vision is to empower government and corporate sector leaders of Singapore and the Asia-Pacific region to respond appropriately and decisively to climate change. Ultimately, this is for achieving a carbon neutral economy and stable global climate. One of the topics that the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions is interested in is that of ecosystem restoration. Protection of ecosystems is still key. However, there's also a need to restore ecosystems which have been degraded by human activities. Tropical peatlands are important and unique ecosystems in this region. They are globally store of carbon, but drainage and deforestation has disrupted the hydrological and ecological processes that sustain these peatlands, switching them from a carbon sink to a source. Restoring damaged peatlands is critical for reducing greenhouse gases and also mitigating fires, yet fundamental processes of how peatland restoration should take place are still not well understood. Today, we have a wonderful panel with rich expertise, and they join us from Singapore, Indonesia, and the Netherlands to discuss the challenges and opportunities for restoring peatland ecosystems. Yulin, next slide, please. So our panel consists of Dr. Alex Kopp, who is a senior research scientist at Sensem MIT and has worked on tropical peatlands in Brunei for the last 10 years. Mr. Wim Geeson, a senior environmental specialist with Euroconsult Mott MacDonald and has worked on tropical peatlands in Southeast Asia since 1985. Dr. Laura Graham from the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation. She has been studying tropical peatlands in Indonesia since 2004. Mr. Benjamin Tay from PM.Haze, which is a local NGO here. PM.Haze works with local communities to develop peatland restoration projects in Indonesia and Malaysia. And Dr. Yuti Fatima, who is a social science research fellow at NTU, and she's studying human peatland relationships through restoration projects in Indonesia. So a very warm welcome to the panel. We are all very excited to have you here. Before we begin, I have to announce some housekeeping details. So during this seminar, please keep your microphones muted to avoid audio interference. Please note that this session is recorded and will be posted on YouTube later. We will have a 20-minute audience Q&A at the end of the session. If you have any questions for our panelists during this event, please submit them to Poll Everywhere at the link. I think this is now being made available on the chat group. So you can upvote questions in this website. So please avoid typing your questions in the chat group because sometimes it's difficult to keep track of them. And instead, please use the website pollev.com. I think it's on the chat group right now. So thank you everyone for your cooperation for these housekeeping details. Today, our 5 panelists will share their expertise and thoughts on this topic on peatland restoration for 7 to 10 minutes each. And then we will proceed to a panel discussion for 20 minutes. So our first speaker, Dr. Alex Kopp, is a senior research scientist in the Center for Environmental Sensing and Modeling, Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, SMART. His work at SMART focuses on forest carbon, water, and energy cycles in Southeast Asian peat forests. So let's hear from Dr. Cobb now. Thank you very much, Dr. Cobb, for beginning this session.
Hi, everybody. In the brief time that I have, I'd like to try to explain what I think is a simple and convenient way of understanding how hydrology is coupled with peat storage or peat accumulation and carbon storage in tropical peatlands. Oh, good, we're moving, okay. I'm going to try to make 3 points. The first is just that the size of the parcels that are created by river networks or drainage canals in peatlands sets a limit on the amount of peat that they can store, which is related to the risk of fire and also to the release of carbon dioxide because of decomposition of peat. When canals and ditches are created inside peatlands, this effectively reduces the maximum amount of peat that the peatland can store. So this is one way of understanding the impacts of canals and ditches. And also, finally, the effects of these canals and ditches can't be fully reversed by dams, at least not in the short term. And I hope by the time I'm done, that will be clear. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly, or also the article with the DOI at the bottom of the screen, which is in press now, talks about a lot of this, and I tried to make it clear for a general audience. Okay, so as you probably know, tropical peatlands store carbon as peat, organic matter that decomposes extremely slowly because of waterlogging. Some of the best known ones are in our immediate neighborhood here in Southeast Asia, in the coastal areas of Sumatra and Borneo, but they're distributed around the tropics. So the reason that organic matter is preserved in these environments is because oxygen diffuses much slower in water than it does in air, and therefore there's very little oxygen available for decomposers to destroy wood, which is the main component of peat in the tropics, either from ordinary woody trees or from palms. So what this means is that, let's see, there we go, now the slide is moving. What this means is that peat accumulates where organic matter is waterlogged. But once this organic matter is no longer waterlogged, then it becomes vulnerable to decomposition, organic decomposition, and also to fire because it's not full of water anymore. So one of the things that people have understood for over 100 years in both tropical and higher latitude peatlands is that over time, peat tends to pile up into sort of mounds. I think you can see my hands, right? Pile up into sort of very gently curved mounds. So by gently curved, I mean, if you look at the slide, this particular peat dome is described by J.A.R. Anderson as about 6 kilometers across and about 3 meters thick. So we call them peat domes, but it's kind of a peat pancake, maybe, very broad and relatively thin compared to its breadth. And yet that slight curvature is what accounts for most of the peat storage inside the peatland. And this shape is an inevitable consequence of the fact that rain that comes out of the sky has to drain out of the peatland, and peat has to be waterlogged to be preserved. So you can't have a sort of peat cliff at the boundaries of a peatland because the peat at those corners will be exposed to oxygen and it will decompose or catch fire. So this means that effectively the way that the peatland is divided up by rivers and canals sets a limit or a capacity on the amount of peat that the area can store. If the peat surface is relatively flat, then peat can still accumulate, can still pile up until it reaches a sort of limiting curvature. And if it's piled up too high, then peat tends to be lost, either to fire or decomposition, until it approaches, again, that limiting curvature. This is just a consequence of the physics of groundwater flow in peat. So in this slide, if you look at the left-hand side, you can picture a peatland where the curvature is relatively small. The water table will reside relatively high in the soil profile, and that means that peat decomposition is relatively slow because the layer of peat that's exposed to oxygen is relatively small, and decomposition will be slower than peat production, and peat will accumulate. On the right-hand side, imagine a place where peat is piled up higher. In this case, water drains more readily. The water table resides lower in the soil profile. Peat decomposes relatively faster overall, and peat tends to be lost. And I should briefly say that these processes of peat accumulation are typically on the order of maybe 1 or 2 millimeters of peat per year in these coastal and interior tropical peatlands, whereas rates of peat lost to decomposition and fire tend to be on the order of around maybe 5 centimeters per year. So that's 25 or 50 times faster than typical peat accumulation. So what this means is that for any particular shape of a bounded peat dome, there's a limit to how much peat it can store. So in this slide, if you imagine a round area, sort of idealized area for peat accumulation, that can store more peat than any other shape of the same area. If you start dividing up the peatland into smaller pieces, its ability to store carbon will be reduced, both because the area of the parcels is smaller, and also if they're longer and thinner, they can't store as much peat because if they have the same curvature, the volume is just not as large. So here's a little cartoon of what happens when a ditch or a canal is dug in an existing peatland. So if you imagine that the peatland already has a particular curvature before the ditch or canal is dug, once a ditch or canal is dug, its limiting curvature is still the same, but because it's divided up into smaller pieces, the peat that was previously above this new limiting shape just can't be stored in this new configuration of the drainage network, and eventually it will be lost, either to decomposition or to fire. So as an example, I'll talk briefly about a site where our group has been working recently in Brunei. This is a fairly large, well, by local standards, a large peat dome, maybe about 10 kilometers across, that was cut by a canal in the 1960s that accompanied the construction of a road. And so what's happened is in the neighborhood of the canal, since it was dug, there's been subsidence, and every few years there are fires. And again, it's just, you can think of it as just sort of a geometric consequence of the construction of this canal. So here's a cartoon of the original dome morphology. Imagine now that a canal has been dug somewhere partway across the dome. If we didn't do anything, the water level in the canal would be similar to the water level in the rivers that bound the peat dome on either side. And eventually all of the material that's above this limiting new equilibrium shape will be lost by fire or decomposition in the long term. What's happened is that since in the last few years, this canal has been blocked by a series of dams. But one of the, again, just sort of geometric consequences of what's happened is that the area around the canal has experienced decomposition and fire and left a fairly wide divot in the peat surface, a couple of 100 meters across. This is not unique to the site. This happens throughout Southeast Asia in places where there are ditches and canals. And it means that there's no practical way for us to raise the water level to what it was before the canal was created. And this means that in the long term, even with this intervention, there's some loss of peat, which can result in fire and decomposition that we can't avoid. And it means that the construction of the dam doesn't really fully reverse the effect of the ditch unless you do it immediately after you construct the ditch. So this is just a sort of example of some of the challenges that arise just from the physics of how water flows in peat and the fact that peat has to be waterlogged to be preserved. So again, just to summarize, the size of the parcels created by river networks and canals creates a limit on the amount of peat that can be stored in tropical peatlands. When we construct canals and ditches, one way of understanding their impact is that they reduce the capacity of the peatland to store peat. And of course, peat that's not preserved is vulnerable to fire and decomposition. And the long-term processes of decomposition and fire and the way that they reshape the peat surface mean that you can't fully reverse the effects of a canal or a ditch by a dam if it's installed any time after the original canal or ditch was created. So, thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Alex, for a very interesting talk, and also, shedding some light about the morphology of these peatlands and how they retain carbon, how they retain water. It's really exciting work. And do check out Alex's research publication on which is noted below on ERL. Next up, we have Mr. Wim Geeson, who will be giving us a talk about peatland revegetation. So Mr. Wim Geeson is from the Euroconsult Mott MacDonald Netherlands-based agency, and he had started working on the Southeast Asian peatlands since 1985. I think his first assignment was to Indonesia, and he has a wealth of experience, especially with regards to the topic of paludiculture and the types of tree species and seedling species that are to be planted in order to revegetate peatlands. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Wim to give his session for this peat revegetation talk.
Thanks for the introduction, Professor Lee, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone attending this meeting. There's a lot to say about peatland revegetation and not much time, so if you have any questions that remain unanswered, don't hesitate to email me, and my email address will appear at the end of the presentation. Next, please. Julian? I'd just quickly like to go through the degree of disturbance of revegetation, say something about natural regeneration, the process of assisted regeneration, which species we can consider for revegetation. I'd like to go through some of the practicalities of replanting and then look at the costs of replanting. Next, please. Let's skip this slide, I think. Sorry. Yuling, can we go to the next slide, please? Before we consider revegetation, we need to know about the history of disturbance of a particular area, which often includes things such as logging, fires, and drainage and that. Next. Sometimes we can be surprised, like I was in North Selangor peatwam forest in 1990s. The area had been logged 40 years before, but this was done using rails, and the hydrology was left intact. So when I was there, it looked exactly like pristine peatwam forest, but only the species composition had changed entirely. Next. If you look at Burback National Park, for instance, we noticed that some areas had a whole history of fire, not just one fire, but repeated fires and that, and with varying amounts of peat loss in these particular areas. And that was something important to know about this area. Next. If you drain a peatland, you lose, like Alex said before, you lose about 4 or 5 centimetres of peat a year. And this decomposition, as a result, leads to loss of peat and increased drainage. Next, please. Now, all this history of disturbance leads to a whole mosaic of different types of disturbance, where areas of peatwam forest have disappeared due to logging or due to fires. And next, please. Next. And there are two main things that we need to map out beforehand, and that is before we go into peatland revegetation, we have to know what the remaining vegetation is like. Next. And what the degree of flooding is, and the duration of flooding. Next, please. Now, we use these two criteria to the remaining vegetation and flooding to guide our interventions on a number of projects we've been working on, and they are listed here. Basically, you see from left to right varying degrees of degradation, which includes a decline in the area of remaining peatwam forest and a steady increase in the degree of flooding. What you also need to recognise in Indonesia is you need to distinguish between areas that have been earmarked for development and those earmarked for conservation, because that will also determine what you can and what you cannot do in these particular areas. Next, please. Oh, both have disappeared appeared at once. In areas that are only moderately degraded, only partially degraded, you could consider natural regeneration, whereas in those areas that are most disturbed, you would consider some form of assisted regeneration. Next, please. Now, for natural regeneration to take place, you have to re-wet the area if it's being drained. And if there's sufficient woody vegetation remaining, natural regeneration will stand a chance. However, there's some points you need to consider there, such as, is there a seed bank? Studies that have been carried out by Laura Graham and others indicate that the number of seeds present as a seed bank are much lower than other lowland forest types, and also they have a short viability. Studies by Grace Blackham show that the seed rain in degraded areas is sufficient for recovery, but often with limited diversity. And also the seeds are often much predated upon. So you often have an 80% removal of seeds within a few weeks. And studies by Lahiru Wujitasu, I think, who's also with us this morning, show that at distances of more than 300, maybe 500 meters, you can still get some form of natural regeneration, but the species diversity will be much reduced, and you may need to do some enrichment planting. Next, please. In areas where natural regeneration cannot take place, you would consider some form of assisted regeneration. Now, you can do that in areas where there's still some forest remaining, forest patches. You can do that with line planting or random planting of mixed species. In areas that have been totally degraded and denuded, you would consider full replanting, and there could be ecological rehabilitation using all sorts of mixed species, for instance, in conservation areas, or you can do polyculture in areas that are being considered for development. Next, please. Now, which species would you use for revegetation? Now, the peatland flora has almost 1,500 species. And luckily, on most programs in which you would be considering revegetation, you would think of tree species. And luckily, half of the flora about consists of trees and shrubs. And also, quite interestingly, 166 of those are pioneer species or species of secondary forest, so fast-growing, fairly hardy. And which shows that there's quite a large percentage of opportunistic species in the peatland flora to choose from. Next, please. When conducting enrichment planting in conservation areas, you would think of things such as, are these species important for wildlife? Do they provide fruit, nectar, or shelter? Conservationists may also want to focus on promotion of unique or rare species, like some of the endemic species that are limited to the Peat Swamp Forest flora itself. Others are just simply uncommon, and you may want to promote those as well. But you can also consider structurally important species like your emergence, or maybe species groups that have disappeared due to logging practices, so such as your shoreas, your Maruntis, or Ramen. Yeah? Next, please. When conducting enrichment planting in development areas, you can consider timber species. There are at least 181 of it that have been recorded in Peat Swamp Forest. But you can also consider a wide range of species that produce non-timber forest products. And past assessments carried out show that you have about 500 or so species to choose from there. Not all of those are trees, of course, but there's quite a range which you can consider. Next, please. And when we're considering species for regeneration, so like I said before, it's wise to choose for pioneers and secondary forest species because they are hardy and fast growing, and they can stand full sunlight, but also a degree of flooding. Next. Flooding has emerged as an important part of important factor to consider, flooding resistance of species. And when working in Burback National Park, for instance, we found that there's quite a difference in flood tolerance of all the various species. And next, please. Next, please. And apart from flood resistance, you also need to plan for succession. We can think of horticulture species, but also practical things such as availability of species, which ones are nearby and which ones can we obtain locally. Next, please. There's a whole series of other practical things to consider as well, such as your source of propagation material, the nurseries you need to establish. You need to prepare a planting site beforehand, the actual planting itself, follow-up, which is often lacking in many areas. You see that there's no weeding or monitoring carried out, or fire prevention, or insufficient in that. There's also predation, for instance, by wild boar or deer. And you also need to consider involvement of local communities, or do we work through the private sector? Next slide, please. My last one. Oh, sorry, there was one on costs. You've missed one. We go back one, please. Hello? There was another slide on costs.
Was it in the next slide?
Missing.
Or... Okay.
Oh, the slide has seemed to have gone. Okay, I'll just do that verbally then. The average cost of, because it's actually quite an important one, the cost of replanting is about $2,500 per hectare, and for enrichment plant, that's for full replanting, and enrichment planting is about 1/5 of that. Now, a lot of these areas, which makes it very expensive. When we're working in Bobak, for instance, we found that re-wetting an area of 6,000 hectares costs about as much as just replanting 53 hectares. So relatively per area, it's hugely expensive. And also a lot of these areas end up burning as well, because they're not tended properly and that. So the go-away message there would be, if you're considering revegetation, you do it only as a last resort measure. Focus most on natural regeneration as much as possible, and replant sparingly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wim. It's a great talk, and also highlights the importance of highlights the importance of different strategies in terms of revegetation, natural, and also assisted or replanting, revegetation. So thanks very much again for the insightful talk. Next up, we have Dr. Laura Graham. And Dr. Laura Graham has studied tropical peatlands in Indonesia since 2004. She works for Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation and has worked on several international research and development projects. Within the BOSF, she has helped to develop the landscape-wide environmental monitoring program, and also has studied in detail fire ecology and carbon emissions related to peat fires, and looked into community-based reforestation techniques and materials. So thank you very much, Laura, for being here. Please go ahead to begin your presentation.
All right, thanks very much, Janice. And thank you to the Centre for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. So I was invited to talk about some perspectives from the field. It was great to hear a lot of the theory and background for vegetation and hydrological restoration from Alex and Wim. And so what I'll be focusing on today is how you turn that knowledge and theory into practice on the ground with local community members. Just trying to move my slide forward. Not currently. Let's see if it'll. Might have to just rely on next. Oh, okay. See if it's working. All right. So I'll be doing this through the perspective of my organization, which is the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation. Of course, we do prioritize the protection of orangutans, but we're well aware that we can only achieve this through protecting their habitat, through empowering and engaging and working with local community members, and we do this through research and education, and that we need to participate with a whole range of different stakeholders and to strengthen the institutional capacity on the ground as well. So BOS has 4 programs across Kalimantan, and I work within BOS Mawas, which focuses on a tropical peat dome in central Kalimantan. It is protected forest area, protected by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and we work with them and support them in protecting the 309,000 hectares of natural tropical peatlands there. It's also one of the, has one of the largest remaining orangutan populations left in the wild. The area covers 2 jurisdictions, South Burrito and Capuas, and around the borders on the river there are 53 villages. So it's really important to appreciate that the forest and the peat have this really highly interdependent relationship. Of course, it was the leaves and the branches and the roots that created the peat, and also it's the canopy of the forest that creates this microclimate which keeps the peat cool and humid. And equally, it's the roots of the trees which hold the peat in place and keep it aerated. So often we're talking about protecting the peat to look after this huge carbon storage. But if we want to protect the peat, we also have to protect the forest above it. And equally, when we lose the forest, we lose a lot of the peat characteristics that provide us with those environmental services. So unfortunately, Mauas, where I work, has seen a lot of forest cover loss. It was included in the area of the Mega Rice project, which was part of the then Indonesian government's big project in the 1990s to convert 1 million hectares to rice production. And to do that, they established thousands of kilometers of canals across the area. And we heard from Alex what kind of impact that has. Equally, local community members also dig in small canals in order to gain deep access into the forest to extract the produce. What it means when you've got canals is that you have access into the forest, and so that often leads to an increase in illegal logging. And so when you have a lowered water table from the canals, increased fuel load from the logging, and an increased human presence, then you ultimately end up with a fire susceptible area. And you can see in the map there that all those red dots are hotspots across part of the Mauas area in 2015. And the photo next to that is my local city of Palangkaraya and what it looked like during the haze crisis of that year. So where that's left us is, of that entire peat dome, about 50% of the forest cover has now been lost. And despite best efforts, we do continue to lose more forest every year, and of course with the orangutan population decline. So can we bring the forest back? We are not just prioritizing within BOS orangutan protection and habitat protection, we also are trying to actively restore the 150,000 hectares of degraded tropical forest. So how do we go about this? We focus on long-term sustainability, and we're aware we need to do this through a range of different approaches and activities, working with multiple different sectors and different disciplines. And what we're really trying to do here is to alleviate the regeneration barriers. We're looking at why the degradation happened in the first place, why it isn't able to regenerate naturally, and what can we do to remove those barriers to allow the forest to come back. So the next few slides are going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour through what we're doing with BOS Mauas. I'd love to talk about each of these things in a lot more detail, but there's only a small amount of time. So I'm just going to touch on all the different activities that we're doing on the ground in BOS, and please ask me questions at the end or email me if you'd like any further details. So the first thing is, if you're going to do restoration, you need to understand your study site. You need to know what trajectory it's on. So we were really fortunate that we were able to work with some international partners to set up a landscape scale environmental monitoring across the area. We have 60 kilometers of transects where we monitor the peat and hydrology. We have nearly 100 vegetation monitoring plots spread across the area. And we monitor them annually, in addition to looking at fuel load change and fires across the area every year. We're really grateful to the international collaborators and researchers that we work with. Just to mention a few here, we've got the University of Maryland and IPB on the NASA project, working with a section of the Australian government ACR and the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia, and RMIT and the University of Palangkaraya. And some of the things that we're looking at is carbon storage and emission from fires and peatland degradation, looking at some of the biophysical and social science needs that we need to focus on for restoration, and looking at some of the carbon and water flux dynamics across the area. So what are we actually doing on the ground? Well, one of the things we can do is focus on hydrological rehabilitation. To block the really large canals requires different technology and expertise, but we can work with the local community members who dug in these small canals. We offer them alternative livelihood compensation packages, and if they're interested, then we can gain ownership of the canals and then block them, reducing access and recovering hydrology in the area. Also, of course, we need to address the issue of fire. And so we ourselves we have a patrol team that goes out several times a month to monitor any illegal logging and fire activities, with a rapid response team to put out any fires. However, fire is initiated by human actions. So we know that the best way to have fire management is to have the communities leading this initiative. So we've worked with 16 villages for them to set up their own village level fire management strategies. So if you've dealt with the fire and the hydrology, then you can start thinking about the vegetation recovery. So we want to put this back in the hands of the local community members. So we've provided resources such as nursery and planting guides, tree and fruit identification guides, provided training and capacity so that they can set up their own community-based seedling nursery programs and set up groups to do the reforestation themselves. And through this, we've replanted several hundred hectares across the area. However, as Wim was mentioning, I'm not moving to the next slide, just like pressing the button, not sure what's happening. Can we get next? Oh, there we go. So as we mentioned, of course, reforestation is hugely expensive, particularly if you've got 150,000 hectares that are degraded. So we also need to explore natural and assisted natural regeneration. So we've mapped across the area and we've monitored which areas we think will regenerate by themselves, which areas require perhaps only low intervention, such as dealing with invasive species and fire management, and which ones require the higher intervention or even full reforestation, but that's our last alternative option. Now, I hope it's been clear in everything I've been saying, the importance that the local community have in this role. We can't do anything without their participation and support. We're really fortunate that we work with a local Dayak community who already have a close relationship with the forest. They appreciate the environmental services it provides and they want to see it there for future generations. So they have a really positive response towards the restoration. However, in these remote villages, you have really limited health, education, and livelihood options, and there are issues over land ownership. So again, we're trying to put that control back in the hands of the community members by helping them to establish alternative livelihood programs, such as things like rubber gardens, fish ponds, pig farming. I mentioned the seedling nurseries. And so we do that through training, but also a microfinancing program to empower them to set their own projects up. And again, we focus strongly on community empowerment, engagement and education. Again, going back to the training sessions, the user manuals, farmer field skills, and so on. And any illegal activities that we encounter, we engage with the local community directly to discuss the issues. Finally, we couldn't do any of this without the institutional support. We're extremely grateful that we can work with the provincial government and the district governments in this area, and we provide them with monthly reports, invite them to meetings, workshops and training events. And I think it's also important to appreciate that we are working with them to help them achieve their goals. The restoration of this area is part of provincial policy. It sits within national strategy and district strategy. So we're working with them to help them achieve what they're working towards as well. And so my take-home message is that, of course, from an organisational point of view, we would love to rebuild these homes for the orangutans. However, we know we can't do that without being holistic and integrative in our methods. So we're applying on the ground interdisciplinary, multi-sector, community-based, landscape scale activities, which we hope will help us achieve these goals. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Laura, for a great talk. I think that was also very comprehensive in terms of what BOSF has been doing for many years. It's also amazing how much science also goes into the work that you do, and also the science that's generated from the site because of how long it has also been there. So thanks very much. Next up, we have Mr. Benjamin T and also Dr. Yuti Ariani Fatima. Mr. Benjamin T is the Executive Director at PM.Haze, People's Movement to Stop Haze. PM Haze local advocacy program includes reaching out to businesses and consumers to adopt sustainable palm oil, but they also have projects where they work with Indonesian and Malaysian communities to develop and implement ecological restoration of degraded peatlands and also sustainable development of community livelihoods. Dr. Yuti Ariani Fatima is a research fellow at the Asian School of the Environment at NTU, and her current research focuses on the role of community participation in peatland restoration in Indonesia, particularly on human and ecology relationships, knowledge production, and also agency of heterogeneous stakeholders in shaping restoration practices. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Benjamin T to proceed with his presentation.
Right. Thank you, Janice, for the introduction, and thank you to my preceding speakers for such interesting and intriguing presentations on your work. So PM haze, we are really looking at the root causes of transboundary haze that plague our region, and we're actually a Singapore-based charity organization that was set up back in 2014. And we're made up of a governing board, a volunteer governing board. I'm part of the executive team, and we work very closely with volunteers and advocates in Singapore to actually find solutions for this problem. So one of the areas that we have developed over the last probably 2 to 3 years, and really just kicked off the project last year, is actually the restoration of community-managed peatlands. And by community-managed peatlands, I mean by peatlands that are inhabited by village communities in Indonesia. And currently we work in a village just off the coast of Sumatra Island, just off the coast of Riau province, and it's called Sungai Tohor village in the Tebing Tinggi district of the Riau province. So that's about a 3-hour ferry ride away from Batam. So it's away from Singapore. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we haven't been able to travel there, but our project actually still continues. So our program is an ongoing effort to restore burnt or degraded peatland through the cooperation and involvement of the local community. And we work very closely with a local NGO on the ground in Sungai Tohor. So this particular organization, EKA, or Economy Creative Andalan, was actually set up by villagers in the village that were really that were affected by fires back in 2013, 2014. And one of the reasons why we decided to work with them was their passion and their motivation to actually rebuild the forests that were destroyed, and to also realize that there is a lot of value in the peatland that they're living in. So apart from working with them, we also have research collaborations currently with the University of Newcastle in Australia, where we're looking at the guided community participation for sustainable peatland restoration in Indonesia, and using Sungai Tohor village as a case study. And we're also collaborating with the NTU. They're actually using our site as a field research site, or at least we were hoping that they could use it in this year, but unfortunately, due to this situation, we're still unable to conduct too much field research in the area. So our rehabilitation program is really guided by the principle of working very closely with the community. So our model is a holistic rehabilitation model where we do revegetation, we do re-wetting, and part of that revegetation, we also provide some incentives for the community by enabling some paludiculture. And the main agriculture that they're in is actually the sago palm agriculture. So in our revegetation, we have conducted a botany study in the area where we identified about 57 species from 29 plant families, and 17 pioneer species were actually found out of it, and 40 climax tree species were found. The information on the nursery is a little bit outdated. We have actually 4 nurseries at the moment, and each nursery has the capacity of nurturing about 3,000 seedlings. And we are looking at peat-friendly species, which we cross-reference from. Very proud to be on the same panel as Geeson. We actually cross-reference one of his landmark papers on this and identified some of the species for replanting and revegetation. So we translocate the seedlings from the nursery into the degraded peatland area. We do assisted natural revegetation in the area as well, because it's not 100% degraded. So there are still mother trees in the area. There's still some vegetation in the area that you're working in. We haven't progressed to the sites that are severely degraded yet. So we're using this as a test bed to find ways to develop our community-led project. We also do regular maintenance of the seedlings. So we do weeding, we do watering of the human watering of the plants, as well as in the part nearer to the canal. We work with the community to actually develop a small plot of paludiculture within the restoration area, where each plot of land we grow about 300 sago saplings. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this, because I know there are a lot of challenges to the agriculture of sago on peatlands, as well as the how quickly it is to actually, how slow it is to actually grow sago. We do rewetting as well, establishing canal blocks in the area. And our establishment of the canal blocks have actually been, we have actually taken quite a measured approach to it, because we realized that we don't have a full picture of the hydrology of the area. So what we're actually doing is we've actually been repairing existing canal blocks, as well as tearing down some of the old canal blocks that are already quite old and tired, and we've actually rebuilt some of these canal blocks. And we support the rewetting by the monitoring of the peat water levels through dip wells in various locations within our restoration area. Sorry, the slides are just going very slowly. We do monitoring of the area as well. Like I mentioned, monitoring the water levels. We've implemented some subsidence poles in the area as well to measure subsidence. Rainfall monitoring. We monitor the plant growth to get a quick estimate of the carbon stock in the area, which we have not been able to implement as yet. But actually, more importantly, our monitoring, the principles around our monitoring is to have monitoring implementations that are feasible for the community, so that the community can actually implement these on their own. And our goal at the end of the day is to develop a model that can be transplanted across different communities in Riau, as well as in other parts of Indonesia. So these are just some of the plant growth measurements that we've taken in the past, and the monitoring of the peat water levels as well. So finally, I come to the point on community development. We feel that community development should be given equal weightage to the ecological aspects of the restoration work. And like I mentioned, some of the incentives we try to provide the community is through sago palm paludiculture. We are trying to develop some form of pineapple paludiculture as well, so as to support the community. And more importantly, I think that it's important to have the community on board, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that need to understand that the area this is where they live in. We also don't want to intervene too much into their lifestyles, intervene too much into their or to impose too much onto them. So some of the things that we've been doing recently is due to COVID-19, they actually had some issues with their subsistence farming. the seed prices in Indonesia actually increased quite a bit. So we actually supported the community by actually distributing seeds to the various communities, as well as develop a community garden initiative, where our partners on the ground, ACA, actually went door to door to help set up these community gardens, as well as to reduce the fire risk in the area as well. We built a community composting house where they could bring their agricultural waste over to a central area, and that's where the waste is composted instead of burnt as they do on a regular basis. And the final point is community education. I must iterate, is something that we hold at the heart of our program. So we hold many of these events and initiatives within the village to help to educate the village about how important it is for them to not only participate in the ecological restoration, but also to develop an understanding that the land that they live on is actually very valuable, and they can do something to unlock that value. Right, thank you very much. I hope to hear from you guys through the questions in the next session, in the second half of the session.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great presentation about the work in Sungai Toho. So I'll invite UT to carry on from here.
Hi, you're on mute. Okay. So my presentation now is gone. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very happy because I'm the last speaker, but it also means that I can skip some of my slides because my slide is really focusing on the context of Indonesian peatland restorations. So we already hear like from Laura and also like from Ben and also like from Alex and Wim about like the technical aspect, but also like the social aspect. And in my presentations, I'm going to extend this like context about like the political situation as well of peatland restorations in Indonesia. So the context of and like why peatland restoration is important is really related to fire in Indonesia. So on this next slide, next. You can see that like in 2015, Indonesia lost 2.6 million hectares of land and emit over like more than 1,000 metric ton carbon dioxide. And this is also like being influenced by the El Nino cycle. So like before 2015, like 97 and 94, there was also like a big fire in Indonesia. But then there, apart from the natural hazard, it's also being influenced like by human. So like for Indonesians, like land clearing is still being considered as one of the options to open their lands because it's considered as cheap. But also like in many cases, there's always like a conflict between like the concessions and the community land. So one of the approaches being adopted by the Peatland Restoration Agency is also like to put like paralegal at the village level. So there's whenever there's like conflict, they can also address it. And then like the reason why peatland has more emit more carbon is because of the composition of peatland. So the idea of participation is really about like asking questions, what participation really means, and like whether like all the villagers, do they really have like the same voice or not? So I'm going to answer those questions from a longitudinal perspective. In the case the same as Ben already mentioned, like in Sungai Toho. So next. So the methodology for this research is done by like field work. Unfortunately, we couldn't return to Sungai Toho because of the COVID-19 situations, but then we already visited the places in November and March. And also we
UT, we can't hear you. UT, are you there? We can't hear you. So I don't know, Ben, can you hear UT? I can't hear her on my end. I think Laura also, you can't hear her, right? Sorry, UT,
No,
I
I
think
can't.
we
I can't
lost
hear
you.
you.
Maybe we would. She might come in again. UT, are you there? I guess again, maybe she had poor internet connection. No. Okay, I think UT had accidentally logged off, or her internet connection may have interrupted her talk. So perhaps we just wait for her for 1 minute, and then hopefully she could get back up to the seminar. Right, UT. All right, you have to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Sure.
All right,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, great.
So yeah, the way we approach this research is by having like a transition approach. So we want to see like how the initiative, like the local initiative, either it's being initiated by the NGO or by the local people itself, and then how it's create like being institutional through like market. So as like Ben mentioned, like in Sungai Tohor, they have like a problem with the marketing their sagu during the COVID. So especially during the COVID, everything's become like more complicated. But also like the infrastructure, because like during the 2002 until 2010, there was like a conflict where like one of the company create like canals which drain all the water in the peatland, and also like the culture and the symbolic meaning of what do the people in Sungai Tohor do for their living. So all these like elements kind of like creating stabilizations on the relationship between like human and peatland, and that is kind of like allowing like the people in Sungai Tohor to participate. So participation is not really like neutral. It's always related with how the people in the village has the agency or the power to involve in the restoration as well. So next. So in this slide, you can see that like the reason why everyone, like each actors has different participation level, you can say that, it's really because of the main issue. So the relationship between like human and peatland in between like 85 to 2002 is really about like experimental. So in the 1980s, initially like people in Sungai Tohor, they experiment with planting like paddy in their field, but then it failed. So the paddy survived, but then it didn't yield, didn't create like any product. So they start to shift to sagu. So at that time, like sagu already been known in the area, but it's like wild sagu. So they are already familiar with sagu, but not really as plantation. So what happened is really people start to experiment like, oh, what this peatland means for them, and then how they can interact with this peatland, and how this like characteristic of peatland really involve or can make their life better. So the actors for this period is really like the local people, so the farmers and the sagu and the mills, and the national governments help the local people by giving them like mills and seeds. But then in 2002 until 2016, it's become like interesting because like the government at that time give concessions to firstly for the Unisraya unit, and then like the local villagers really against this company, and they even burn the house of the head of the village. So you can really see like the participation in this period it's really active, but probably in a negative way. But they really have they own their agency, and then they burn the head of the village. I won't say this is good, but it's just like showing that like people really have the ownership of their land. And it's also getting worse by the entrance of this company. So in 2017, in 2007, the government gave concession to this company for more than 10,000 hectares. And then this company digging canals over 10 kilometers length, and then 12 meters. So basically it's like a huge canal where it drained the peatland very bad. So like the people are really against these companies because it's drained their land, and then most of their sagu die. So what happened during this period is they collaborate with the NGO. So this is NGO at the regional level, And then through this NGO, they create like a campaign asking like the governments to react on it. And what make this like movement succeed is in 2014 there was a fire in this area. So the local people and also like the sub-district government together with the NGO, they use this like fires and also like the locality of like sagu, which is good for the peatland, to call like the president of Indonesia. So at that time in 2014, Joko Widodo just being elected, and they use it as like a campaign, like, hey, you used to listen to the people, so just come visit us, and because there's like fire. And during this period, Joko Widodo promised the local people to evaluate the concession. So what happened is like in 2016, they received like formalizations of that the concession is being canceled, and then like the local people get access to their land. And also because 2014 Joko Widodo came to the area, like Sungai Tohor is also become like a showcase. So there's many like international agencies and also like national agencies that came to Sungai Tohor, give a lot of money. So the situations where people like involved in peatland restoration is quite easy, because in the sense that it's being highly exposed, and most of the people and especially like some of the elites, the local elites, they really realize that this is something that can make our life better. And they also have like a lot of festivals to support like peatland activities in the area. So like the culture is there, and also like they already got like the regulation decree for the social forestry. So they have like the formal and also like the cultural supporting this shifting to a new relationship between human and peatland through sagu processing. So next. So on the last slide, the conclusion is really like human and peatland restoration. Human and peatland relationship is quite complex. Next. But then like in Sungai Tohor, it really helps through the sagu. So it's luckily that the one that's being accepted by the community is sagu, which is good for peatland as well. And because they have like a long history of sagu, it's kind of like shape the whole like relationship between human and peatland in Sungai Tohor. And also like the national government's roles in the area change over time. So at the beginning, the national government involvement in Sungai Tohor is not very much. They even like support the sagu plantation by giving them like meals and also like seeds, sagu seeds. But then from 2002 until 2014 or 16, they start to shift by giving like the land access to the concession. And then at the end, after like a lot of pressure from the NGOs and also like the international like attention to this particular area, then people in Sungai Tohor also start to kind of like shift and then realize that they have to maintain their sagu and especially their peatland. Thank you very much. Okay, return back to Janice.
Thanks very much, Yuti, and thanks very much, Ben, for giving us this case study of Sungai Tohor. I think today's webinar and all these seminars, they first start off with a very broad picture, looking at the peat dome from Alex and also the hydrology, and then moving into more peat revegetation, the ecology side of things, having a great case study from BOSF, from Laura, and also moving down even more specific to the village level and to a specific site in Sungai Tohor. And we have lots of great questions as well from the audience. So this is on the polev.com/CNCS website. If you haven't yet submitted your question, please feel free to do so here. And I think we could start off with some really broad questions. One of them being, how do we define a successful peatland restoration in practice? And also what factors contribute to these best cases? And I think, this is a question that even as I talk also about peatland restoration, other contexts and also with other stakeholders, people often ask, what exactly is this restoration? How can we define it as being successful? So it's a great question. And I think maybe this could start off with the other questions. And I'll just open this to the 5 speakers in our audience. So Perhaps we just start with Laura.
I think it's sad that we don't have more successful case studies yet. And I think it's indicative of how difficult the situation is. What I tried to convey in my presentation, and I think has been clear throughout the whole session with all 5 presentations, is there are so many disciplines to think about. You know, you have to consider the politics and policy of the situation, the economy of the situation, local community participation, and then you have to assess the peat health, the hydrology of the system, the different vegetation types. So it's funny, kind of, how do you define successful peat restoration? You could say, well, which discipline are you talking about? Or, you know, if you're talking about all of them, how on earth do you combine them? And it's one of the, I mean, I was just whizzing through all the projects that I was participating in when I presented earlier, but one really exciting project that we've been working, partnering with BOSS is this ACR Ministry of Environment and Forestry from Indonesia and a range of Australian academic institutes. And it's a project that has 5 objectives, kind of loosely sat within 5 disciplines. So we're looking at fire ecology, soil ecology, alternative livelihoods, policy, and knowledge management. And we have academics associated with each one of those objectives. And we're doing research within our objectives and making progress within our objectives. And we're now reaching the point of saying, well, how do we bring this into a single narrative? You know, how do we combine our understanding to say, because it's a single peat dome, the peat dome is not in, you know, caring about which discipline it's dealing with. But I think as observers or users of the system, it's very easy just to see it through your own academic or disciplinary lens. And I think that's something that we're grappling with at the moment. You might talk about hydrological indicators or vegetation indicators or economy indicators, but it might be that the economic situation goes up when the vegetation situation goes down. So we need to be very careful what we're dealing with. And it's definitely, I think it feels like perhaps for the last couple of decades, we've stuck to our own disciplines and we've acquired a lot of knowledge. Hopefully the next decade of tropical peatlands will be interdisciplinary and much more looking at how we answer it as a whole.
Thanks very much, Laura. Wim, Alex, Ben, and you. Maybe we start with Wim. All right, I'll just unmute you.
Sorry, Janice, you mean the same question or the next question down?
If you have anything to contribute for the first question.
Well, I think Laura has done very admirably. I think it's just so many different sides of peatland restoration to look from. Yeah, it's you can be successful in re-wetting, but the revegetation may fail dismally, and the local communities may not be involved, and you find that things reverse within a very short period of time. I think in terms of natural regeneration, I think that how do you defining if that has been successful? If you go back to an area and you find that it looks exactly like a pristine peat swamp, yeah, then you probably been successful. But there are very few examples of that at all. Yeah.
Alex, do you have anything to contribute on this?
Not really, honestly. I mean, I guess I part of the what I was hoping to convey with my talk is that hydrologic restoration, in the sense of reverting the hydrology of peatland to what it was before ditching and drainage, is not a straightforward thing at all. And so I think maybe the point is just that from a hydrologic perspective, within the context of a restoration project, it's good to recognize that it's been transformed in a somewhat irreversible way, and you have a new hydrologic system now to deal with. But I mean, of course, this is something at every restoration project deals with in practice, because they start, for example, seeing flooding in areas that previously weren't flooded, and yeah, along with the fires in places that there weren't previously fires. So.
Right, thanks very much. I think we could probably move on to the next question. And I think this is with regards to paludiculture. Can paludiculture become a viable mode of income to compete with oil palm and also pulpwood? So these are commodity crops which we often see in growing over peatlands. I think for this question, perhaps like Wim, Laura, Ben, and UT, you guys have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. May I just start on that?
I
think the short answer is yes. But the problem is that both all palm and pulp species that are cultivated on peatlands, which are mainly Acacia crassicarpa, they've all had the advantage of many decades of improvement of the systems. The systems are well understood. There's a lot of knowledge there based on these production systems that have benefited these specific drainage-based systems. Whereas paludiculture, it's just the species that can be used in that are poorly studied. We don't know much about growth rates or the specific requirements and that. So there's a lot of catch-up to do there. But I think at the moment, if you compare the production per hectare per year of paludiculture with oil palm and acacia, you'll find that the oil palm and acacia are probably many times more productive in terms of dollars per hectare per year. But with the catch-up, that could easily be, that gap could become much smaller. Also, you need to look at different timescales, because both oil palm and acacia are drainage-based. And we know that at the end of the line, if you continue draining your peatland, these areas will gradually become flooded. So production will become zero at some point. Yeah? And so if you look at 10 years, maybe oil palm is fantastic by comparison. If you look at 50 years, it's terrible, because there's no more production after let's say 2 or 3 decades, because due to flooding. With paludiculture, you can also have additional carbon benefits as well. If those are factored in, then probably you'll see that the overall net benefits become much more favorable for paludiculture than for these drainage-based systems.
Ben and Laura, if you have any maybe inputs or insights from your specific locations where you're working at.
Yep. If you don't mind, I'll just take a hit on this question. Yeah, I totally agree, Wim. I think that definitely there are a lot of benefits, ecological benefits to paludiculture as opposed to kind of the oil palm or acacia agriculture, which requires a lot of drainage of the peatlands. But I think for us, having interacted with the community for these past 2 or 3 years, we've realized that, you know, even when we assess this problem, I think that we need to kind of go downstream as well and realize whether these paludiculture species have any kind of market significance in that sense. I mean, one thing that I think I'll struggle with sago, for example, in Sungai Tohor, and I do have a caveat that, you know, my experience is limited to the Sungai Tohor village community, and I've seen how the challenges they've had, for example, like what Win mentioned, right? I mean, a lot of the agriculture around oil palm and acacia have actually benefited from, you know, the last 50 or even 100 years of development in terms of the systems, in terms of production capacities and R&D and things like that. And you can't say the same for sago in this area, because, you know, I mean, firstly, the production processes, for example, of converting the wet sago, the wet flour, which you convert from the from the sago, right, into the wet starch, and then from the wet starch into dry flour. That process is not owned by the community, at least the community that we work with. I think this becomes a challenge, because if you don't own that part of the value chain, right, then, you know, there is very little incentive in that sense, or rather there is the incentives are not as I guess as how should you put it, incentives are not as attractive, right, as compared to maybe other kinds of crops. But of course, the other thing to realize is that, you know, peatland is there can, I mean the thing is that there is a difference between peatlands and your regular kind of mineral soil land, right? Your lowland forest kind of areas. And I think that, you know, if we can develop some kind of system around for paludiculture species on peatlands, and you know, maybe slowly have a strategize an exit plan for some of these dry agriculture species to move away from peatlands. I mean, that might be something that will be beneficial for both the community and for the companies as well that are producing some of these agricultural commodities.
Thanks, Ben. Laura, you have anything to add, or you good?
I'm good, thank you.
All right, so we'll move to the next question. Thanks very much, Wim and Ben, for answering that one. Other questions which are top on the list, I think, are more related to ecology as well. So one about the ecological indicators that degraded peatlands. What are they? What are the ecological indicators that degraded peatlands have the capacity to naturally regenerate within years to decades? And then the second question also about more on paludiculture question. Is there an optimal balance between paludiculture and restoration back to natural forested conditions? So perhaps Wim, if you want to answer any one of those two questions.
Yeah, let me just first address the first one.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ecological indicators that degraded peatlands have the capacity to naturally regenerate. I think the most important question there is, how was it degraded? Now, the example I gave briefly during the presentation was from North Selangor peat swamps, where the logging had been carried out without drainage. At the time, they were using rail systems. It wasn't very nice to look at. If you were in one of these areas that have just been logged, you thought perhaps only 10% of the trees were left standing. The rest was an absolute mess. So it wasn't that they went through the areas lightly. But anyway, in spite of that, this type of logging, as long as the fires didn't come in, and the hydrology remained pretty much intact, that the systems tend to return to something that looked pretty much like certainly to the layperson, like a natural peat swamp forest within 4 decades, from what I saw. So yeah, that capacity is there, but it depends very much on the hydrology, how fires come in, and what has happened since then. If you drain an area and and there've been various fires, it will take a long time. And especially if flooding sets in. I'd like to just mention that the case of the Siak Kecil River in Riau in Sumatra, where you have a whole string of lakes along river, like pearls on a string, let's say. I thought, oh, very interesting when I visited the area 30 years ago. Turned out that they were caused by fires. And thought, oh, that's probably something recent. But then I went back and looked at maps of more than 100 years previously, and they'd already occurred there. So over the course of more than 100 years, there'd been no natural regeneration after fires that occurred along the Siak Kecil River. So there's a range of possibilities, and yes, it's possible, but it depends very much on the whole variety of circumstances, not all of which we fully understand.
Thanks, Wim.
If I could briefly add on to that, just very quickly, so just to sort of extend what Wim was saying, we have sort of maybe a negative example in Brunei of another site that was also logged by rail and never drained and hasn't experienced any fire. The areas that were logged the longest time ago were logged about 30 years ago, and those areas look more or less indistinguishable from the places that were logged 5 or so years ago. In that case, it seems like
Sorry, Alex, you are on mute. I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Did you miss all of that? Did
Maybe
you hear
the
any
last
of it?
5 seconds.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. Anyway, just to say that this is a case. I mean, as Wim was saying, I think it's highly dependent, and this is another case where there's been virtually no recovery over the course of 3 decades, despite a lack of drainage because of the local ecological conditions.
Laura, you have anything to contribute on this?
I think slightly more theoretical, but it was something that I've been really interested kind of observing it as a science developing and thinking, gosh, it really potentially could apply to tropical peatlands. Within the study of restoration ecology, one of the things that's becoming more and more talked about or kind of popular in study is this theory of the resilience of different systems and then reaching a tipping point and the different stability of the systems. And there are some systems that are very stable within their natural healthy state, and it takes a huge amount of disturbance for them to reach their tipping point and switch into a degraded state. And they represent this by kind of curves where you know, the current state is like a ball sitting in the curve, and the amount of disturbance that goes into that system allows the ball to move up the curve and potentially reaching this tipping point and then heading into this another kind of curved place where it sits in a state of degradation. And then it's the amount of effort that you potentially need to put in to tip it back towards restoration. And whenever I see this presented on or read articles about it, I always think, you know, tropical peatlands must have this very, very shallow dip of where their natural state is. And the ball, just with a little amount of disturbance, tips out of this, you know, steady state of natural health into this degraded steady state. And it takes a huge amount of energy and effort to push it back up into its steady state of health. And I think, you know, as I said before, we're at a point where we have a lot of knowledge and understanding across the different disciplines, but lining them all up at the same time to really explore how successful we can be, or what are the ecological indicators that we're going to monitor across that journey of recovery. We're still learning that, but I think it's sometimes helpful to think about it being a very non-resilient system and very easily tipped out into this state of degradation that it's then very hard to push it back up into its steady state of health.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think that's about the regime shift and then the different alternative stable states, right, in ecological resilience theory. Yeah, we have had really good questions about the ecology of this peat swamp system. So I think there are 2 other questions, perhaps before we end off with the last question. So one about peatland restoration being conducted by corporations. So is peatland restoration conducted by land that's owned by corporations, and then how, if so, how do NGOs strike a balance since this entails trade-offs? So maybe I could direct that question to you, T. And then another question is about microfinance. So this one's more specific to Laura about microfinance programs that you manage, who's eligible, what does the lending agreement entail, where does the money come from? So Yuki, if you could address the question about restoration being conducted on land or owned by corporations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like for Indonesian case, like 1.6 million is under the land concession, and then only like 900,000 hectares is being managed by the government. So what happened is like the Peatland Restoration Agency, they can have like program on the government land, but then like for the concession, it's kind of like responsible of the companies that own the concessions to have this peatland restoration happening. But then like from our experience being in the field, usually like the company has obligations to restore some of the area, but after it's being handed over to the governments, then the obligation is being returned by the government. So yeah, there are like one cases like that, and so it is really like a responsibility of everyone to be involved. But then like the way the government can handle the restoration is really limited, and because most of the area is being owned by the concession.
Do you have any thoughts about how NGOs strike a balance and
So I have like experience interacting with the NGOs, and they collaborate with companies, but then the type of collaboration is really like assisting at the local level. So usually like a concessions in a peatland area, and they have a village that they supervise, and then like there are cases where the companies collaborate with NGOs, especially at the village level, or like hiring like a consultancy to work at the village level. But it really depends on the company itself, because there's cases where the company is really involved, because like for concession it's usually like around 30 years, and then like if they want their concessions to have like a good support from the community, they really try to involve the community to support their concession. But then there's also a company that only give like, okay, I have like this 1-year program and I will give you some like projects, but then after that, that's basically it. And the working system is really by rotating the villages instead of like always continuously collaborating with all these villages. So it really depends on the companies as well.
Thanks, Yuti. Laura, some questions about microfinance in the program that you are heading.
Thanks, Janice. So, I mean, I have to confess, I work within Bosmawas on the environmental monitoring program, and we have extremely skilled and experienced staff members who handle the microfinancing program. So I have a loose understanding of how it works, but there are other people who could answer this better than me. And it's one of our most popular programs, and it's really nice because it really puts the control and the initiative back in the hands of the community members. So normally there's a period of socialization. As I said, there's 53 villages where we are, and so we try to work with as many as we can across different periods of time, but it's usually, you know, entering in through the village head, seeking engagement to set up a workshop, and presenting the idea behind microfinancing, and then it's up to the community members if they want to opt in or not. We don't do it for individuals, but it's cooperatives, and it's up to them to come up with the proposal, the initiative. Again, we do provide training and ideas of microfinancing, alternative livelihood options, but at the end of the day, the decision is up to them whether they're interested in setting up fish farms, pig farms, seedling nurseries, and they would put together a proposal saying, this is our cooperative, this is the number of members, this is the amount of money we need for setup, this is our repayment scheme, and it's all, you know, there's no interest involved. It's a simple payment, and the fund, as I say, it's been very popular, and we've had international donors from Europe who've supported this scheme for a number of years, and we've really seen positive uptake, and I think it builds trust and it builds a relationship. So from what we've seen, it's it's a really good way to get engagement and to allow the community to be in charge. They want to be empowered, they want to make their own choices, they just often don't have that initial setup finance to make these decisions. And so if we can provide that for them in a kind of no risk, no interest setting, then they feel very enthusiastic about that.
Thanks very much, Laura. So I think that's all the time that we have for questions. We have really great questions from the audience, but unfortunately, I think we're already at 3:30, and I also don't want to take up more time from our audience members and also from our speakers. So if you have any questions that you have for our speakers, feel free to send them an email and to follow up with the questions that you have. And I think at this point, we would have to end our webinar. And I think before we end, I would like to just thank all our speakers once again, if we could, I don't know, unmute ourselves and like clap for them or like show it on the platform, you know, a sign of appreciation for the great talks that they've given, and also the insight that they give us about peatland hydrology, ecology, and also the use of peatlands in Southeast Asia. So it's great to also hear the different case studies from Brunei, from Malaysia, and also from Indonesia. So thanks very much to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for your time.